I still remember the moment my son looked at me in the middle of that road trip and said something I will never forget. He said it calmly, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. Mom, you came to help, not to enjoy yourself. In that instant, every small moment from the trip suddenly made sense. The seat in the back row, the dinners I missed, the photos I took but was never in. I realized something painful. I had not been invited on that trip as family. I had been invited as help. And that realization changed the rest of the journey in ways none of them expected. Before we dive into today's story, take a moment to share where you're tuning in from. We love seeing how our stories connect people from all around the world. Your comments and thoughts bring this community to life, and we're so grateful to have you on this journey with us. If you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. Now, grab a cozy seat, maybe a cup of coffee or tea, and prepare yourself for a tale that will captivate your heart from beginning to end. Let's begin. My name is Margaret Collins, and I am 64 years old. I live alone in a quiet house in Portland, Oregon, a house that once felt full in a way that is difficult to describe now. My husband Daniel and I bought it when we were both still young enough to believe that time moved slowly. The maple tree in the backyard was barely taller than the fence back then. Now it stretches across the entire corner of the garden and shades the kitchen window every afternoon. Sometimes I sit at that window with my coffee and watch the leaves move in the wind, and it feels like the house remembers more than I do. Daniel and I were married for nearly 40 years. We were not the kind of couple who filled a room with loud affection, but there was always a steady warmth between us. He woke early every morning and brewed coffee before the sun rose. Even in winter, he would stand by the back door and comment on the garden as if the plants could hear him through the frost. He had a quiet way of noticing things. When something difficult happened in my life, Daniel rarely tried to solve it. He simply stayed close and listened, which often turned out to be the better kind of help. Before I retired, I spent more than 3 decades teaching history at a high school just outside Portland. I stood in front of classrooms full of teenagers and explained revolutions, elections, and the complicated ways people shape the world around them. Teaching required a certain confidence. You could not stand in front of 30 restless students without learning how to speak clearly and hold your ground. For most of my adult life, I never doubted my voice. Daniel used to joke that I could win an argument even while half asleep. When Daniel died 3 years ago, something inside my daily rhythm changed in a way I did not expect. Grief did not break me, but it altered the way I moved through the world. I became more careful about the space I took up in other people's lives. The house stayed the same, the garden stayed the same, but my sense of place in the world shifted quietly. I found myself measuring my words before I spoke them, especially when I talked with my son. My son, Ethan, lives in San Diego, California, with his wife, Vanessa, and their 2 children. Ethan works long hours and seems to carry the steady pressure of providing for a young family. I try not to add to that pressure. I call occasionally, but not too often. I visit when invited. I remind myself that every generation eventually builds its own center of gravity. One afternoon in early summer, Ethan called while I was watering the small herb garden near the back porch. I remember the sunlight on the concrete and the smell of damp soil when I answered the phone. At first, the conversation sounded ordinary, the kind of short check-in that fills the space between visits. Then he mentioned that the family was planning a long road trip along the West Coast during the summer. They planned to start in San Diego, drive north through California, stop in San Francisco, continue past the redwood forests, and eventually reach Washington State. Ethan spoke about the trip casually, but then he added a question that caught me by surprise. He asked if I would like to come along. The invitation filled me with a sudden warmth I had not expected. I said yes, almost immediately, before I had even considered the details. The thought of spending time with my grandchildren and seeing the coastline again felt like an unexpected gift. I even offered to help cover several of the hotel reservations along the route. After Daniel passed away, the insurance and my pension left me financially comfortable, and helping felt natural. At the time, I believed I was simply joining a family trip. I did not realize yet that the role waiting for me on that road would be something entirely different. If you're still watching and this story already feels a little too familiar, comment number 1 below so I know you're here with me. Because what looked like a simple family road trip was about to reveal something I never expected. Now, let's move on to chapter 2. When I arrived in San Diego, the first thing I noticed was the light. It was brighter than the soft gray skies I had left behind in Portland, and it seemed to settle over everything with an easy warmth. Ethan's neighborhood sat on a quiet street lined with pale stucco houses and small palm trees that swayed gently in the ocean breeze. It felt calm and comfortable, the kind of place where both families built busy lives. Inside the house, however, calm was not the word that came to mind. The moment I stepped through the front door, I could feel the energy of preparation moving through every room. Suitcases stood open on the living room floor. Backpacks were lined up near the kitchen counter. The children were running from room to room, with the excited restlessness that only appears before a trip. Vanessa seemed to be standing at the center of all of it, moving quickly from one task to another with a printed sheet of paper in her hand. She had organized the entire road trip down to the smallest detail. Hotel reservations had already been confirmed, restaurant suggestions written down, and driving routes carefully planned for each day. I admired the efficiency. It reminded me of the careful planning I used to do when organizing school field trips for my students. At first, I simply watched and tried not to interrupt the rhythm of the household. I had joined the trip after most of the planning was finished, so it felt natural that Vanessa and Ethan already had everything mapped out. I told myself that my role was simply to fit into the plan as smoothly as possible. The morning we left San Diego began early. The sky was still pale when Ethan pulled the rented sport utility vehicle into the driveway. It was larger than the car they normally drove, a wide vehicle with 3 rows of seats and enough space for all of us and our luggage. Ethan took the driver's seat naturally. Vanessa sat beside him with a tablet that held the route for the day. Vanessa's parents settled comfortably into the middle row. That left the 3rd row for the children and me. I did not think much about the arrangement at first. The children seemed happy to sit with me, and I had always enjoyed their company. I helped them fasten their seatbelts and handed out the small bags of snacks Vanessa had packed for the drive. One of the tablets needed charging, and the other had trouble connecting to the internet once we moved away from the city. I adjusted settings, restarted applications, and passed juice boxes back and forth as the miles began to stretch along the highway. Outside the window, the coastline slowly unfolded. Long cliffs dropped toward the Pacific Ocean, and the road curved along the water in a steady ribbon of pavement. It was beautiful in the quiet way coastal landscapes often are, with wide views that seemed to stretch endlessly toward the horizon. Inside the car, however, most of the conversation happened several feet in front of me. Ethan spoke with Vanessa and her parents about restaurants they wanted to try in San Francisco. They discussed traffic patterns, real estate prices, and a friend who had recently opened a business in Northern California. Their voices blended easily with the steady sound of the engine. Every so often, Vanessa turned slightly in her seat and asked me to keep the children occupied while they talked. The requests were always gentle, never demanding, and I answered them without hesitation. I played guessing games with the children, handed out more snacks, and helped them adjust their blankets when they grew tired of sitting upright. By the time we reached our first hotel that evening, I had fallen naturally into the small rhythm of taking care of the children. At the front desk, Vanessa quickly arranged the room keys. Ethan and Vanessa took one room. Vanessa's parents were assigned another room down the hall. The final room was connected directly to the children's room through a narrow interior door. Vanessa explained that this would make things easier if the children woke up during the night. I smiled and told her it sounded perfectly reasonable. Later, lying awake in the unfamiliar bed, I listened to the soft breathing of the children through the thin wall. The day had moved smoothly enough, and I reminded myself that family trips always develop their own patterns. Still, as the hotel grew quiet around us, a small thought lingered in my mind. I had imagined this trip as a vacation, yet somehow, without noticing when it happened, I had already begun working. If you're still watching and you're starting to notice the small details that didn't feel quite right, comment number 2 below to let me know you're paying attention, because the next moment on this trip would quietly change the way I saw everything. Now let's continue with chapter 3. The drive into San Francisco felt different from the long, quiet stretches of highway we had followed along the coast. Traffic thickened as we approached the city, and the landscape slowly changed from cliffs and open water to neighborhoods packed closely together on steep hills. The children pressed their faces against the windows as the buildings rose higher around us. Even from the back seat, I could feel the excitement building in the car. They had seen the Golden Gate Bridge in books and school projects, but seeing it in person was something else entirely. As we climbed the final road toward the overlook area, the fog rolled across the towers in slow white ribbons. The bridge itself seemed to appear and disappear in the shifting mist. When we parked, the wind coming off the bay was colder than I expected. It pushed against our jackets and carried the sharp smell of salt and metal from the water below. Tourists filled the viewing area, people speaking in different languages, cameras lifted toward the sky where the red towers of the bridge rose above the fog. Vanessa suggested that we take photographs before the fog thickened any further. She stepped toward me and placed her phone in my hand with a quick smile, asking if I could take the pictures. I stepped backward across the pavement until the entire group fit inside the frame of the screen. Ethan stood in the center with his arm around Vanessa. Her parents moved closer beside them, leaning slightly together as the wind tugged at their jackets. The children stood in front laughing as the gusts pushed their hair across their faces. Through the camera, the scene looked almost perfect. The bridge stretched behind them in a long red line, disappearing into the mist, and the whole family stood gathered together in front of it. I took one photograph, then another, adjusting the angle slightly so the towers would appear clearly behind them. Years of organizing school events had taught me how to capture a good group photograph, and I made sure to take several versions so they would have options later. When I finished, I lowered the phone and looked at the group standing together on the pavement. For a moment, I remained where I was, holding the phone in my hand. It crossed my mind that I could ask someone nearby to take a picture that included me as well. A few other visitors stood close by, already taking pictures for one another. It would not have been difficult, but something inside me hesitated. The group looked comfortable exactly as they were, laughing together while the wind swept across the overlook. Stepping into the frame might have changed that rhythm in a small, awkward way. So I walked back toward them and handed the phone to Vanessa. We stayed at the overlook for a few more minutes before continuing into the city. The afternoon passed in a series of small stops along the waterfront. We walked past crowded sidewalks near Fisherman's Wharf, where street vendors sold hot bread and clam chowder. The children watched the sea lions resting on the floating docks, barking loudly at one another as tourists gathered along the railings. By evening, we returned to the hotel, tired from the wind and the crowds. Ethan and Vanessa began discussing dinner plans almost immediately. They had heard about a seafood restaurant near the harbor that people said was worth visiting. Vanessa mentioned that the restaurant was usually crowded and not particularly comfortable for young children. She suggested that it might be easier if the kids stayed at the hotel for the evening. The idea settled naturally into the room before anyone questioned it. I told them it would be fine. I helped the children change into comfortable clothes and ordered simple food from the hotel menu while the others left for dinner. Later, after the children had started a movie and the room grew quiet, I sat near the window and looked down at the lights of the city spreading across the dark water. The photograph from earlier in the day returned to my thoughts. Through the camera lens, the family had looked complete, and I had been standing just outside the frame. If you're still watching, and that moment at the bridge made you feel something, comment number 3 below so I know you're still here. Because what happened in the forest next would turn a quiet suspicion into something much harder to ignore. Now, let's move on to chapter 4. We left San Francisco early the next morning, before the city had fully woken. The streets were still damp from the fog that had settled overnight, and the sky carried the pale gray color that always seems to hang above the bay in the morning hours. Ethan guided the sport utility vehicle through the quiet streets and back toward the highway while the children slowly shook themselves awake in the back seat. The farther north we drove, the quieter the road became. The crowded neighborhoods and steep city hills gradually faded behind us, replaced by long stretches of highway that curved along the coast and through small towns. The Pacific Ocean appeared again in brief glimpses through the windows, flashing silver beneath the low morning clouds. As usual, I sat in the third row with the children. The pattern of the drive had already become familiar. It passed snacks back and forth between small hands, untangled headphone cords, and helped the younger one restart a game that had frozen on the tablet. When the older child grew bored of the movie playing on the screen, I began a guessing game to pass the time. None of it felt difficult. In fact, it felt natural in the way caring for grandchildren often does. Still, I could not ignore the quiet realization that the rhythm of the trip had already formed around certain expectations. The adults in the front seats discussed the route ahead, occasionally mentioning restaurants or scenic stops that had been recommended online. Their conversation moved easily from one subject to another, while I stayed occupied with the children behind them. By late morning, the landscape began to change. The highway curved inland, and the coastal cliffs slowly disappeared behind thick green forest. The trees grew taller with every mile, their trunks rising straight and narrow along the edges of the road. Then the redwoods appeared. Even from the car window, they looked enormous. Their trunks were wide and dark, their branches reaching so high that the tops vanished somewhere in the pale light above the forest. I had read about redwood trees many years earlier, but seeing them in person carried a quiet sense of awe. When Ethan pulled into the parking area of Redwood National Park, everyone stepped out of the car and stretched after the long drive. The air inside the forest felt cooler and heavier than the open coast, and the ground beneath the trees was soft with layers of fallen needles. Near the trail entrance stood a large wooden sign displaying several hiking routes through the park. Vanessa studied the map carefully while the children wandered around the base of the trees, looking up at the towering trunks. One of the trails led deep into the forest and stretched several miles through the park. I found myself quietly hoping we might walk that path. I had imagined what it would feel like to stand among these ancient trees, to walk beneath something that had existed long before any of us arrived. Vanessa eventually turned away from the sign and looked toward the children. She mentioned that the trail might be longer than expected, especially for the younger one. She suggested that it could be easier if someone stayed closer to the parking area in case the children grew tired. Her eyes rested briefly on me when she said it. I nodded before anyone else spoke. It seemed reasonable that the children might not enjoy a long hike through the forest. I told them I could walk a shorter path with the kids and wait nearby while the rest of them explored deeper into the park. They thanked me, and the conversation moved on quickly. Later that afternoon, Ethan returned briefly from the trail to collect a few extra water bottles. The children and I were sitting on a wooden bench near the edge of the parking area, watching small birds move through the underbrush. As he gathered the supplies, Ethan spoke casually, almost as if the thought had only just crossed his mind. He said it was helpful that I had come along on the trip because managing the children made it easier for everyone else to enjoy the activities. Then he added a sentence that settled heavily in the quiet air beneath the trees. He reminded me that I had come on the trip to help, not to enjoy myself. The words were not spoken with anger or impatience. They carried the calm tone of someone stating something obvious. But as Ethan disappeared back down the trail, the silence of the forest seemed to grow deeper around me. For the first time since the trip had begun, I realized that the role I believed I had accepted might not have been the one they had imagined for me at all. If you're still watching, and you can already sense the tension building, comment number 4 below to let me know you're with me. Because the next moment I overheard something that would change the entire meaning of this trip. Now, let's continue to the next part of the story. By the time we reached the lodge that evening, the sky above the forest had already begun to darken. The building stood at the edge of a long clearing surrounded by towering trees that seemed to swallow the last of the sunlight. It was the kind of quiet place travelers choose when they want to escape the noise of cities. A wide wooden structure with deep porches and soft lights glowing from the windows. Inside, the air smelled faintly of pine and polished wood. The lobby held a large stone fireplace and several worn leather chairs arranged in a circle. It felt peaceful, almost timeless, as though the forest had been standing there long before any of us arrived and would remain long after we left. After checking in, everyone moved upstairs to settle into their rooms. The children were already tired from the day in the forest. Their energy faded quickly once they changed into pajamas, and they curled together on the bed while I helped them brush their teeth and wash their faces. Downstairs, the lodge restaurant had begun serving dinner. Ethan mentioned that the dining room looked busy and that the adults planned to eat together before the kitchen closed. The children had already eaten small sandwiches earlier in the evening, and they seemed content to stay in the room watching a movie. I told Ethan that I would stay with them. The arrangement did not surprise anyone. In fact, it slipped naturally into place, as if it had always been the plan. Vanessa thanked me briefly while she adjusted her jacket and prepared to leave the room. A few minutes later, the hallway grew quiet again as the adults walked downstairs. The children fell asleep not long after the movie ended. Their breathing settled into the slow rhythm that fills a room with the comfortable silence of deep sleep. I tucked the blankets around them and turned off the lamp beside the bed. For a while, I simply sat in the chair near the window, listening to the faint sounds of the lodge. Somewhere below, dishes clinked softly in the restaurant. Outside, the wind moved through the tall trees with a low whisper that rose and faded again. Eventually, I realized I had forgotten to fill the small ice bucket that sat beside the dresser. I stepped quietly into the hallway and walked toward the ice machine near the end of the corridor. The hallway was dim, lit only by small lamps mounted along the walls. The carpet muffled my footsteps, and the entire floor seemed wrapped in the same deep quiet that surrounded the forest outside. As I turned the corner to walk back toward my room, I heard Vanessa's voice. She stood a short distance away near the stairwell, holding her phone against her ear. She was speaking softly, the relaxed tone people often use when talking with close friends. I had no intention of listening, but the hallway carried sound easily. Vanessa laughed lightly during the conversation. She explained that the trip had been busy, but enjoyable. Then she mentioned something that caused me to pause where I stood. She said that bringing Ethan's mother along had actually worked out well. There was another quiet laugh before she continued speaking. She explained that having me on the trip made everything easier because there was always someone available to watch the children while the rest of them went out or explored places that might not be ideal for kids. Her voice carried the comfortable tone of someone describing a helpful arrangement. She said it was almost like having free childcare. The words were not sharp or cruel. They sounded casual, the way people describe something practical that simply makes life easier. I stood in the hallway holding the ice bucket, listening as the conversation moved on to other topics. Eventually, Vanessa wished her friend good night and walked down the stairs toward the restaurant. I remained there for a moment longer before returning quietly to my room. The children were still asleep, their small faces peaceful beneath the soft yellow light of the bedside lamp. I sat on the edge of the chair near the window and looked out into the dark forest. For the first time since the trip had begun, the pieces of the past few days settled together in my mind. The seat in the third row of the car, the photographs I took but never joined, the dinners I missed, and Ethan's quiet reminder in the forest earlier that afternoon. Slowly, the picture became clear. I had come on this trip believing I was part of the journey, but somewhere along the way, I had quietly become part of the arrangement. I woke earlier than usual the next morning. For a moment, I lay still in the quiet room, unsure what had stirred me awake. Then I remembered the conversation in the hallway the night before. Vanessa's voice had been light and casual when she said it, but the words had settled somewhere deep in my thoughts and stayed there through the night. Outside the window, the forest was just beginning to brighten with the first thin lines of morning light. The tall redwood trees stood silent and unmoving, their enormous trunks rising far above the roof of the lodge. The air drifting through the slightly open window felt cool and clean. I sat up slowly and watched the light change across the room. The realization that had begun the night before did not feel sharp or angry when I looked at it again in the morning. Instead, it felt calm, almost steady. The pieces of the trip had finally arranged themselves into a picture I could no longer misunderstand. I had spent the past several days doing exactly what everyone expected me to do. I helped the children settle into the car. I passed snacks along the back seat. I stayed in hotel rooms while the others went out to dinner, waited near trail entrances while the rest of the group continued deeper into places I had hoped to see. None of those actions had been forced upon me. I had stepped into them willingly, the way a grandmother naturally helps when children are nearby. But somewhere along the way, the helping had quietly become the reason I was there. The room was still quiet when I dressed and gathered the children's jackets from the chair beside the door. I helped them wake, brush their teeth, and pack their small backpacks for the day. The routine unfolded exactly as it had every morning of the trip. Downstairs, the lodge dining room was already busy with travelers starting their day. Ethan and Vanessa spoke with Vanessa's parents about the long drive ahead. The conversation moved easily between plans for lunch and the next place they hoped to visit. When breakfast ended, we returned to the car and continued north. The forest slowly thinned as the highway stretched toward Washington state. For long stretches, the road ran straight ahead through quiet land that seemed almost empty. The children dozed beside me while the adults spoke softly in the front seats. I watched the road through the narrow space between the seats and let my thoughts settle. After a while, I reached into my bag and took out my phone. The signal was weak in some places along the highway, but eventually the search page appeared. I typed in a simple question about flights from Seattle to Portland. The screen refreshed slowly before displaying several options. One of them was scheduled for the following morning. The flight was direct and short, less than an hour in the air. I stared at the screen for a long moment while the car continued forward along the road. The decision did not arrive with drama or urgency. It appeared quietly, the way certain truths sometimes do after enough time has passed. I selected the flight and entered my information. When the confirmation appeared, I placed the phone back into my bag and looked out the window again. The landscape moved steadily past us, mile after mile of quiet highway. Later that evening, after we arrived at the hotel in Seattle, everyone gathered in the lounge to discuss the next day's plans. The conversation flowed easily around the table. I waited until there was a small pause before speaking. I said that I would be flying home the next morning. The words settled into the room like something unexpected but not entirely surprising. Ethan looked at me with quiet confusion, and Vanessa seemed briefly uncertain how to respond. I kept my voice calm and explained that I had enjoyed seeing the children, but felt it was time for me to return home. No one argued. A few minutes later, I returned to my room and closed the door behind me. For the first time since the trip had begun, the quiet inside the room felt entirely my own. If you're still watching, and you're wondering whether leaving was really the right decision, comment number 6 below, so I know you're still with me. Because what happened later that night between a mother and her son would change their relationship in a way neither of them expected. Now, let's move on to Chapter 7. That evening, the atmosphere in the hotel lounge changed in a way that was difficult to name, but impossible to ignore. Only a short time earlier, the group had been discussing plans for the next day with the relaxed confidence that had carried us through the entire trip. Now, the conversation moved more slowly, as if everyone were carefully stepping around something that had not been fully understood. After I mentioned that I would be flying home the next morning, the discussion faded into a quiet pause. Vanessa looked briefly at Ethan, and Ethan glanced down at the table before continuing to sip his coffee. No one immediately asked questions, and the conversation eventually drifted towards smaller subjects. A little while later, I excused myself and returned to my room. The window overlooked a section of the harbor where small lights reflected across the dark water. Seattle felt calmer at night than it had during the day. The distant hum of traffic moved softly through the air, but inside the room, everything remained still. For the first time since the road trip began, I felt a strange sense of quiet control. The decision to leave had not been made in anger. It had come slowly, almost gently, after the realization had settled into place. I was sitting in the chair near the window when I heard a knock on the door. When I opened it, Ethan stood in the hallway. His expression carried a kind of uncertainty I had not seen in him for years. He stepped inside the room and closed the door behind him. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he asked whether my decision to leave had something to do with what he had said earlier in the forest. His voice was careful, as though he was searching for the right way to ask the question. I told him that the decision was not about a single moment. Instead, it came from understanding the pattern that had formed during the trip. I explained that I had come expecting to share the experience with the family. Somewhere along the way, however, my role had slowly narrowed into something different. I spent most of the days helping the children while the others moved through the trip in ways I rarely joined. I made sure he understood that I did not blame the children for any of it. Caring for them had never been the problem. The silence that followed was long enough for both of us to think about what had been said. Ethan finally admitted that he had not looked at the situation from that perspective before. In his mind, bringing me along had seemed like a practical way to help everyone enjoy the trip more easily. I nodded because I understood how that might have happened. I also told him that I had allowed the situation to continue without saying anything earlier. I had been trying to avoid creating tension, and that silence had made the arrangement seem natural. The conversation did not end with an apology or a clear solution. Instead, it ended with a quiet understanding that something important had finally been spoken aloud. Ethan stood near the door for a moment before leaving the room. After he was gone, I returned to the chair beside the window and looked out at the city lights again. The night felt different now, not because everything had been resolved, but because the truth had finally been allowed into the room. I woke before the alarm the next morning, long before the sounds of the hotel began to stir outside the door. The room was still dim, the pale gray light of early morning just beginning to slip through the narrow opening in the curtains. For a moment, I remained in bed, listening to the quiet. It was the same kind of quiet I had known in my house in Portland during the years after Daniel passed away. Not empty exactly, just calm in a way that allowed thoughts to settle without interruption. I rose slowly and began packing my suitcase. There was not much to gather. Most of the things I had brought on the trip had remained folded in the same corners of the bag where I had placed them days earlier. A sweater, a pair of walking shoes, a small book I had planned to read during the drives but never opened. As I folded the last shirt and closed the suitcase, I realized that the feeling inside me was not disappointment. When the trip began, I had imagined returning home with stories about long drives and beautiful places we had shared together. Instead, I was leaving early. But the decision no longer felt like losing something. Downstairs, the hotel lobby was nearly empty. A single traveler sat in one of the chairs near the window, reading a newspaper while a clerk stood quietly behind the front desk. I arranged for a taxi to take me to the airport and then returned upstairs to gather the rest of my things. The children were still half asleep when I knocked softly on the door connecting our rooms. Their hair was rumpled from sleep, and their voices carried the slow softness that belongs to early mornings. I hugged each of them carefully. They asked where I was going, and I explained that I was heading home but would see them again soon. They accepted the explanation easily, the way children often do when they trust the world around them to remain steady. A short time later, Ethan walked with me down to the entrance where the taxi waited. The morning air outside felt cool against my face, and the city was beginning to wake. Cars moved steadily along the street, and the distant sound of traffic blended with the low rumble of buses passing through the intersection. Ethan placed my suitcase into the trunk and stood beside the open door for a moment. He said that he had been thinking about our conversation from the night before. He admitted that he had not considered how the trip might have looked from my side. In his mind, he had simply been trying to make the vacation work for everyone. I told him that I understood. Families rarely see the same moment in exactly the same way. He apologized quietly, and I nodded because the apology felt sincere. It did not change what had happened during the trip, but it showed that he had begun to understand something he had not noticed before. We hugged before I stepped into the taxi. As the car pulled away from the curb, I watched the hotel grow smaller in the side mirror. I did not feel anger. I did not feel regret. What I felt instead was something quieter. For the first time since the trip began, I felt like I was moving forward again under my own direction. If you're still watching and you're curious about how this story truly ends, comment number 8 below to let me know you're still here. Because the final part of this journey isn't about revenge or anger, it's about something much deeper. Now let's move toward the ending of the story. The airport in Seattle was quieter than I expected. Morning light spread across the wide windows of the terminal, and only a few travelers moved slowly between the gates. After the steady motion of the road trip, the calm of the airport felt almost peaceful. I passed through security without much delay and found a seat near the window overlooking the runway. Outside, the sky had turned a pale blue as the sun climbed higher above the city. Planes moved slowly across the tarmac, guided by small vehicles that flashed yellow lights in the morning air. Sitting there gave me time to think. Over the past week, I had watched the coastline pass by through the window of a car. I had stood beneath the towering redwood trees and listened to the wind moving through branches older than any memory I carried. I had taken photographs of my family in front of the Golden Gate Bridge while standing just outside the frame. For several years after Daniel died, I had quietly shaped my life around the idea that I should not ask for too much space in the lives of others. The road trip had simply revealed how far that habit had grown. When boarding began, I walked onto the plane and found a seat beside the window. As the aircraft lifted off, the city below slowly faded beneath a thin layer of cloud. The land stretched outward in wide green patches before disappearing into the distance. By the time we landed in Portland, the familiar cool air of home greeted me outside the airport doors. Driving back through the quiet streets of my neighborhood felt steady and comforting. A few days later, Ethan called. Our conversation lasted longer than usual. He said he had been thinking about everything we discussed in Seattle. I listened, and for the first time in a long while, we spoke honestly instead of carefully. Families rarely solve everything in a single conversation. But sometimes one honest moment is enough to begin changing the direction of the road ahead. Several weeks passed after I returned home to Portland, and life gradually settled back into a quiet rhythm. The house felt familiar again, in a way that was both comforting and steady. Each morning I opened the kitchen window and watched the light move across the garden while the maple tree rustled softly in the wind. For a long time after Daniel died, I had believed that the best way to keep peace in my family was to make myself smaller. I tried not to ask for too much time, too much attention, or too much space in the lives of the people I loved. The road trip had shown me something different. It showed me how easily a person can disappear when they spend too much time trying not to be in the way. In the weeks after I returned, I began doing small things that belonged entirely to me. I signed up for a photography class at the community center. I spent afternoons walking through the neighborhood with a camera, learning to notice details I might once have overlooked. Ethan called from time to time, and our conversations felt a little more honest than before. One evening, Vanessa sent a message saying the children missed me and hoped to visit soon. I smiled when I read it. Love in a family does not disappear when you claim your space. Sometimes it simply grows stronger once you finally allow yourself to stand fully inside it. Sometimes life does not change through loud confrontations or dramatic moments. More often, it shifts quietly in the small decisions we make about how we choose to stand in our own lives. There comes a time when every person must remember that kindness does not mean disappearing, and love does not require becoming invisible. Taking your place in the world is not selfish. It is simply a way of honoring the life you have lived, the experiences that shaped you, and the dignity that belongs to every human being. When you allow yourself the space to exist fully, something surprising often happens. The relationships around you begin to grow healthier, more honest, and more real. Sometimes the most powerful step forward is not an argument or a victory. Sometimes it is simply choosing a different road and walking it with quiet confidence. Thank you for spending your time with this story. If it touched you in any way, feel free to share your thoughts in the comments below. Your perspective might help someone else who needs to hear it. And if you enjoy stories like this, do not forget to follow and subscribe so you will not miss the next one.